Okay. I think we can still see, or we can see that people are still joining, but I think it's probably good to make a start with the webinar. So hello and welcome everyone to the launch of Public Futures and our database. My name is Franziska Paul, and I am a research associate on the Global Remunicipalisation project, which is led by Professor Andrew Cumbers here at the University in Glasgow in Scotland. Just briefly, our project is funded through the European Research Council. And over the 5 years of the project, we aim to conduct this kind of transnational analysis of remunicipalization cases across the world, hence global remunicipalization. Today, however, we are very excited to launch the Public Futures database. And sort of needless to say, the construction of this database has actually been an amazing collaborative effort. So we decided to start this webinar by acknowledging some of the hard work that kind of went on in the background behind it. And for this, we would firstly like to thank Satoko Kishimoto at the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam for her tireless and longstanding work on issues of remunicipalization and public ownership more widely. And it actually is really down to Satoko and her team at TNI that there is any data in the database we launched today. So a bit of context on that, there are currently over 1,450 cases in the database, which is just fantastic. And collecting and verifying them dates all the way back to 2015, when Satoko and her team conducted the first of many surveys with participants from trade unions and civil society groups, as well as kind of others working on public services. And based on these results, started establishing a data set on remunicipalization. Here we would also like to thank another organization, that is Public Services International, or PSI, the Global Union Federation for Workers in the Public Service Sector, who do amazing work around trade unions and public ownership and have been instrumental in collecting cases among their union constituents. So we will hear more about PSI's work on remunicipalization later from one of our panelists, Daria, Cibrario. Yeah, and well, basically the data set that kind of came together following Satoko's initiative and with the help of many, many others around the world, including kind of activists and researchers, we, like TNI, ended up publishing 2 reports, which were Reclaiming Public Services in 2017 and The Future is Public in 2020, as the data was kind of growing and evolving. And some of the data was also presented at the Future is Public conference, which was held in Amsterdam in 2019, late 2019, and which many of the people here have probably also been to. So welcome back in a way. And it was at that conference really that TNI and our team here at the University of Glasgow realized that it would be great to improve public access to the huge amount of data that is in the database and it has been collected over the years, and importantly also to make it interactive so people across the world can add to this data set and contribute their knowledge. And with this in mind, we wrote an application to the University of Glasgow's Knowledge Exchange Fund, which was successful. So thanks to the university for the monies we received from that, and then set out to construct this kind of global interactive database. However, we are all social scientists. So while we had this amazing vision, we had very little knowledge on how to construct a database that was technically robust enough to allow for kind of safe and interactive public use. So this is where the computing science department at the University of Glasgow comes in, specifically a project led by Dr. Tim Storer and Omar Tufail, which puts computing science students in touch with projects in the wider university community that are in need of web developing like us. So it's a great initiative, and thanks to the fantastic work of Tim, Omar, and Inesh, who is our current developer, as well as 3 former student developers, we are very proud to present a sleek-looking and technically robust Public Futures database to you today. And just before I hand over to Beth, we actually had planned to put resources in the chat today, but we had some technical issues with this. So we'll be sending out the recording of this webinar and then also a sort of document with a lot more on public ownership and remunicipalization written by TNI, such as the reports I mentioned, a lot of resources from PSI, as well as more on John Mcdonnell's project that he will be speaking to later. So thanks again for joining us today. And I'm now handing over to Beth, who will introduce our exciting speaker panel.
Thank you, Fran. Hello, everyone. My name is Beth, and I'm also a research associate on the project. Before we do meet our panelists, I just want to highlight that we will be having a Q&A section at the end of this. You're welcome to submit any questions using the Q&A function, which you should see is an icon in the bottom right hand of your screen, and you can submit any from this point onwards. If you want to address the question to a particular panelist, please feel free to put their name on it. If you want to be named in your institution, for instance, also include that information just so we know that you're okay with having your name read out and you don't want to stay anonymous. However, anonymous questions are also welcome, of course. Okay, so if we move on to meet the panelists, here we all are. You'll probably recognize a few faces if you've been to similar events before. We have Andy Cumbers here, who's a professor in regional political economy at the University of Glasgow, principal investigator of this global remunicipalisation project, and author of Reclaiming Public Ownership, Making Space for Economic Democracy. So he's then at the bottom of my screen there, I'm not sure is in yours. We have Laura Stegemann. She's our PhD student on the Global Remun project, and was also a former database research officer for the Transnational Institute. She's currently also doing an internship on the database funded by the university, which has been a fantastic asset for us. We have Daria Cibrario, who's local and regional government officer at Public Services International. And last but not least, we have John Mcdonnell MP, who'll begin the webinar. John, as many of you will already know, is Labour MP and former UK Shadow Chancellor. He's also the editor of the book, Economics for the Many, which a few of us on the panel have read. He's currently deeply involved with the Claim the Future project, and I think he'll be talking about that today in terms of its public ownership policy. So John, thank you for joining us today, and I'll hand over to you now.
Thanks, Beth. I wondered if people thought I was Zoom bombing this event, so I better explain why I'm here, really. First of all, just on a personal basis, although I've been in Parliament for the last 20 years, just over 20 years, before that I was 20 years in local government. And I, both as a council officer, as a civil servant, and as an elected politician. As an elected politician, I was the deputy leader, but possibly more importantly, the chair of finance on the Greater London Council. I was, if you like, the Chancellor for the Chancellor of the Exchequer for London. And after that, although I'd worked on the front line of local government in social services, after the GLC was abolished, I then became the chief executive of the Association of London Government, representing all the London boroughs, Conservative, Liberal and Labour alike, in the development of strategic policy and the representations to government, particularly around resourcing. So I've had a deep and a lifetime, virtually, in terms of my adult life, involvement in the delivery of local services in some form. And for my generation, and it is for my generation really, we did stand on the shoulders of quite significant local government leaders, both in terms of elected members, but also of officials as well. A century and a half of municipal development of public services. The first development of really universal basic services for the many, to use a more recent term. And it was on the basis of that, many of us were attracted into local government. We felt we could change the world on the basis of what we could do within our local communities. And I was part of that tendency called in and against the state, whereby we went into the local state to transform the state relationship into one which was much more thoroughly democratic and engaging, so that people could develop the local services that they needed in a way in which they wanted them shaped. A lot of that came to an abrupt halt in the late 1970s, but certainly from the mid-1980s onwards. And we were hit with a wave of privatization and outsourcing as neoliberalism, well, hegemonized economic and political thinking at the time. And it was my generation, I have to say, who's been straddling those two periods where we had the height of public delivery, if you like, built on from the Attlee government onwards, and then the wave of public ownership and delivery being forced back by this dominance of neoliberalism. It's interesting now, I'm hoping I'm now going to straddle the next period, which is actually the reassertion of the municipal role in the provision of public services, and the next wave, which is, well, deprivatisation, but also not just bringing back the services that have been privatised, but the extension of services as well as new needs are developed. And I just cite one example of that, which is broadband communism, as I was accused of less than 18 months ago, when we promoted universal broadband as a universal basic services, free at the point of delivery, provided by the public sector, engaging with municipalities as well as national government. It's interesting just how many people have been converted to that policy in the recent period during the pandemic on the basis of the need for a decent broadband connection. But the issue for me is exactly this, and this is why I actually think this project is so significant, and I think will make such a significant contribution to the future, particularly people being able to access the database that's available. We've gone through a period of privatisation where we've lost democratic control of so many of our public services. And we have to remind people very clearly, it was about profiteering. It was about privatisation of public services so that resources were diverted from direct delivery of those services, often into, well, dividend payments, and also in looking at the examples that we've seen, into quite significant management salaries and benefits as well. And the result has been not just lack of democratic control, but as a result of that lack of democratic control, actually lack of quality of delivery of the service itself, the failure to coordinate public services effectively in terms of joint challenges that they face. But I have to say also, and I speak as a constituency MP on this, dealing with it on a regular basis, the harsh realities of that profiteering, the sweating of the assets, as there was the policy, which has resulted in cuts in wages, the undermining of working conditions. And interestingly enough now, filtering out the impact even more greatly now, a generation of undermining of people's pensions that were in the public sector at that time. And also the longer and more extensive exploitation, intensive exploitation of the workers whose roles were privatized. That trend, the database demonstrates this right the way across Europe now. People have woken up, I think, to the implications of privatization. And now we're seeing that trend of remunicipalisation in particular at the regional, local level, and public services being brought back in. Because people, I think, have reacted against the poor quality of private services and privatisation, but also reacted with some anger as well about the feeling that they're being ripped off, paying for poor quality services, expensive services in which the service charges seem to increase every year no matter what. And I cite water as possibly one of the worst examples in the UK of that, where we've seen massive profits being made. And in some instances, the companies themselves being used for tax avoidance scams as well. And yet at the same time, quite abysmal delivery of the service itself, the exploitation of the workers, and the failure to integrate into any form of planning with water in terms of the threat that we face from climate change itself. So I think the trend is reversing, and it's rapidly, and the database will demonstrate that. The issue for me is just how valuable the database is, because more and more local communities now are looking at the services that they need within their local community. They're looking at the services that they're being provided with. They're critically assessing the failure of privatization, and therefore there's an increasing trend. And it's interesting, it's an increasing trend that's catching the wind in many political parties, that actually there needs to be a bringing back under municipal control in particular, those services. So the database will provide people with, I think, the examples of what's going on across Europe. Lessons can be learned, so it avoids reinventing the wheel, but also I think it will give people confidence that it can be done. and that actually the hegemony of privatization under neoliberalism, that paradigm now is beginning to shift. And I think it's beginning to shift rapidly into one where a new paradigm is being set, which is around the provision of universal services, basic services. It's around the provision where value is more assessed on the social value rather than the market value. And it's also, I think, being reassessed on the basis of community, but by community, I mean democratic control. And that leads to then the issue around democratic ownership. I'm involved in this project you mentioned, Beth, about, we call it Claim the Future. It was a group of us met 9 months ago, maybe a bit longer, 10 months ago, at the beginning of the pandemic. And we were looking at the issues that people faced in the pandemic, but also what would happen post-pandemic. So it was about bringing people together, researchers, policy experts, as well as campaigners on the ground, to look at the immediate issues facing our community, but then also to plan for the sort of society that we want to create after the pandemic. And then looking at some of the policies we need to develop immediately that would prefigure that society. And what came out of that was, well, very basically a view, well, first of all, a recognition that actually, as a community during the pandemic, we care for one another, but we need one another. And that actually what we needed was to ensure that we could organize our resources effectively to survive the pandemic and then learn the lessons about the nature of the society that we want to create afterwards. And it's quite, I think it's been quite interesting. And we've been bringing together all these discussions, panels, we've published a range of papers. They're all on the Claim of the Future website. But what's come out of it is an increasingly strong acknowledgement of the role of the state in particular, the invaluable role of the state. So all those arguments about the reduction of the state, the small state policies that have been pursued by successive governments, particularly during the decade of austerity, that now being challenged, and a recognition of just how much we rely upon the state itself, but not just in crisis periods as well, and the role that the state can play. But it's interesting, the emphasis is on the local state rather than just central government itself. And that's then developed into a discussion about, yes, what sort of society do we create? We need to create post-pandemic, but also the recognition that we're now going to face up to the existential crisis of climate change. And therefore, what role has the state to play in that, both at national, but importantly at the local level? And the discussions that have taken place is a recognition that actually, if the local state is to be effective, it needs to be able to deliver and democratically control a whole range of services to create the sort of society that people would want to live in and have a decent quality of life. And therefore, I think it feeds into the surge towards municipalisation and public ownership generally. That's why, I can't, the Glasgow University, the TNI and PSI, this collaboration, I think, is critically important. It will serve, I think it will serve all of us who are working towards that new wave of municipal and public, democratic public ownership and control so much more effectively. I think it'll be an invaluable resource. I just want to congratulate all those involved. I think it's visionary at the same time. I think we're ahead of the game now, drawing upon this resource, and it will give, as I said earlier, it will give confidence to people who want to actually, I hate to use the expression take back control because it's got other associations, but actually it is about people taking back control of their lives and their own communities, and they can do that through public ownership and democratic control. I think at the local state level, that does mean remunicipalisation. I think this project is exactly what's needed at the moment. Thanks.
Thank you so much, John. That was great. We're now actually going straight over to our next speaker, and that is Andrew Cumbers. Andy, you might have to unmute yourself there.
Is that better? Good. Yes, I'd like to add my thanks to those that Franz already expressed, to everybody for coming along today, to all the speakers, but also to all the incredible people, especially Stoko and the team, for putting the data together that's gone into this database. What I want to do today, Laura is going to talk to you all a little bit about the nature of the database and how it works. What I want to do, can people give me a thumbs up if they can see my PowerPoint on the screen share? Yeah, thank you. What I want to do very briefly is to sketch out some of the key trends that we've seen, and I've only got about 8 to 10 minutes to do this, so I'll be very brief. But there is a global mapping report that we are about to produce, which should be coming out in the next couple of weeks. And there are other papers, and there's work by TNI and papers from TNI, which will be on the slides that you can make a note of as we go along. But what I want to do is I just want to give you some basic trends at work, if you like, in the development of this whole process of global remunicipalisation. And I want to also reflect a bit more critically, both on the data, the nature of undertaking this data analysis, and also some of the political implications, I think, that come out of both the remunicipalisation trend and also the very sort of political issues around actually presenting the data in the first place, which has been ignored by a lot of the mainstream in terms of actually documenting this trend. So, as Fran has mentioned, the database is incredible. It captures, and the work done by TNI is incredible. It captures about 1,455 cases of remunicipalisation around the world that we're aware of in 56 different countries. The first thing to say is that this is almost certainly an underestimation of this process, because these are just the cases that we know about. If you take some work that's been done in France, for example, by Olivier Petitjean, who's been working with TNI, he estimates that the number of water remunicipalizations that's gone in France is probably double the number that we're actually recording in this database. So it's worth saying that this data is probably on the low side in terms of an estimation of a trend that's going on. So it's even more momentous a process than we're actually documenting here. As a trend, it's a global one. I think it's worth saying that, but it is concentrated in particular places, and it's particularly prevalent in the global north, and especially, as you'll see from these two maps, in Europe, where we have key epicenters. Outside of Europe, it's quite interesting that there's been a massive growth in or development of remunicipalisation in the US. And I'll come on to talk about it a bit later on. There's actually some interesting developments there in some of the new sectors that John was talking about. It's less prevalent in the global south, but nevertheless, we do see it on all continents in the global south. And I think what we can say there is a lot of the trend towards remunicipalisation is a pushback against Washington consensus imposed privatizations, particularly in the water sector. And these have been documented in the past by people like Cibrario at the University of Greenwich, excellent work of David Hall and Emmanuel Labina and their colleagues, and also the Municipal Services Project, which I think originally came out of Canada, and the work of David Mcdonnell. But obviously, the TNI work has been instrumental in getting to know about these cases, as we've already mentioned. And you'll see some of the resources, I think, there you can look at. In Europe, which I think it's interesting, Europe has been the dominant continent associated with remunicipalisation to date. We do see key epicenters if you look at the map, particularly Germany in the energy sector, France in the water sector, but also, interestingly, the UK has become a key epicenter of insourcing in local government. And also Spain is a very interesting country at the moment, where we see remunicipalizations happening across different sectors. And it's worth saying, particularly with the experience of Germany and France, a lot of the remunicipalizations that have been occurring there are pushback against the 1990s privatizations that were enacted by centre-left governments, sort of third-way governments, as much as centre-right actually in the 1990s. And what's been happening in places like Germany in particular is when these privatized franchises come up for renewal, many municipalities are just either cancelling or taking back control because of the poor performance of privatization. So it's a global phenomenon, but it is concentrated in particular places, particularly in Europe and to a lesser extent in the US. If we look at where it's emerging in terms of sectors, as is evident, I think, from the pie chart there, the energy and the water sectors have been the dominant sectors to date. Energy, in particular, has about a quarter of all the remunicipalizations that are happening around the world. And it's worth saying that the lion's share, most of the energy remunicipalizations, well over half, I think, possibly more, Laura might know more about that, well over half are happening in Germany and are linked to a whole set of national political developments in Germany, as well as kind of the broader dissatisfaction with the effects of privatization. But I think a key issue in Germany has been the country's strong environmental movement and the real kind of grassroots push, if you like, to move faster in transitioning from carbon-based gas and coal fuels into renewables. So that what we're finding in Germany is that as a lot of the energy contracts that were signed in the 90s come up for renewal, local politicians, local political actors are mobilizing to take energy infrastructure and services back under public control so that they can have much better integrated capacity to be able to advance the whole energy transition agenda as a part of tackling climate change further. So I think we see a particular concentration of remunicipalisation in Germany in the energy sector, but actually there's quite a lot of water remunicipalisation going on in Germany as well. And again, that's a pushback against sort of centre-left as well as centre-right neoliberal-driven kind of privatizations in the 1990s. The water cases that we see in the database outside of the global south, they tend to be focused in France and the US. If you want to read further into this, there's some really good material produced by TNI and their colleagues, which is available on their website, which I'll refer you to. In the UK, I think a really interesting trend since 2010, and David Hall at Cibrario and colleagues has been capturing some of this work really well, usefully. But there's been quite a significant shift back to insourcing, I think, in the UK since 2010. Many people will be aware of that, but again, I'd refer you to David Hall's work, which has been very important in uncovering that. And the other interesting thing, just to say, in terms of sectoral trends, in terms of growing trends, is that there's been a clear growth, I think, in two areas: health and care, which I think in the context of the pandemic is really something important to reflect upon. But also there's been quite a big growth in telecom, and in particular in the US. I think, just picking up on John's point, a lot of US citizens would be very astonished to know that the US has actually become the kind of epicenter of broadband communism, if that's the label they want to give it, in recent years, with a growing number of local municipalities and communities setting up their own publicly owned broadband networks. And what they're doing actually is filling a gap in an otherwise private market, which is not actually providing the services that communities need. So it's almost back to the kind of 19th century emergence of original municipalisms, which were filling gaps left by the private sector and the market there. In terms of ownership, I think in our database we can differentiate between the following. I think it's worth saying that a third of the cases that are in the database are cases where we see the return of privatized services to public ownership. So that, if you like, is pure remunicipalization. Sorry, 2/3, I should say. So most of the cases are in the database are sectors, activities that are returned to public ownership from privatization. But for me, what's also really interesting is the growth in new forms of public enterprise and new forms of public ownership, such as the community broadband that I've just been talking about. So a third of the cases that we see are newly created public enterprises. So I think, and again, this isn't something you hear much about in the kind of mainstream media, that actually there's been a massive proliferation around the world in setting up new public companies at the local level, particularly in the broadband sector. But I think one of the other interesting cases that we've picked up is in Chile. There's been a massive growth of publicly owned pharmacies across the country in recent years, to give you one example, which again is a response to the lack of care in either the private or perhaps traditional state-owned sectors. It's also worth saying that our database does capture deprivatizations beyond the local level, and I think about 0.8% of our cases are examples of renationalization. So the database isn't just reporting on what's happening locally, but it does report on higher level returns to public ownership as well. If we look at how things are organized, I think, again, what's quite interesting is that we can say that a lot of the forms of ownership that are emerging are fairly conventional. So I think 49% of new forms of public ownership are directly owned by government. 28% tend to be public enterprises that are either arm's length from government, or municipalities have a majority stake. But there has been an interesting, though relatively small, growth in what I would call hybrid forms of public ownership, whereby we're seeing new forms of public cooperative ownership that try to involve citizen groups or workers in the ownership and control of enterprises. And I think, as I say, this is quite a small trend, but if you think about 5% across a population, a total sort of sample population, or a database population of about getting on for 1,500, that's a few hundred basically hybrid forms of public ownership that are emerging. I think these are really interesting, and one of the things we want to document in the project and look at is the implications for these kind of new forms of public ownership for increasing democracy, participation, and citizen engagement. If we move on to my final bullet point there, I think it's worth saying that if you look across the database, 64% of what we're seeing in terms of remunicipalisation is single case remunicipalisation at the municipal level. But there's also quite a significant growth in municipalities getting together to create forms of ownership or return forms of private ownership to public control through collaboration. So 23% of what we record is actually intermunicipal public ownership as well. One of the things we've been really keen on getting to grips with at a much greater level is the motivations behind remunicipalisation. I think it's worth saying the database is quite limited here because actually what activists and what people have been doing when they supply details is they've been reporting on cases and if you like, providing a basic description of what's gone on. What we don't know really is much about the overall motivations or the processes that are going on around remunicipalisation. So one thing I'd really urge people to do is to respond to a survey that we're running. If you look at the bottom part of the overhead here, we're running a detailed questionnaire survey of remunicipalisation. So if you know anybody or you've been involved in a remunicipalisation process, please fill in our survey. We're particularly short of information about what's happening in the UK and the US actually in the survey, but I think it's really important that we get some more detailed, robust statistics so we know more about the process. What we do know about motivation suggests to us that a lot of the main problems and the reasons behind remunicipalisation are indeed the failings of privatisation, particularly the failure to deliver the improvements or modernisation in the quality of services, or actually the promised cost reductions that would come through privatisation not materialised. It's interesting to reflect that these are still two of the assumed or promised benefits from privatisation that are still being pushed by dominant and powerful hegemonic bodies like the IMF, the European Commission, the OECD. So I think we've got the information here, we've got the data here that we really need to combat that kind of mainstream pressure that privatisation works. So we've got plenty of evidence over 20 or 30 years of this great experiment to kind of debunk some of those policy myths. And interestingly, at a smaller level, but a lot of the, if you look at the other kind of motivations that people give for why things were returned to public ownership, it's about taking back democratic public control. It's about also using remunicipalisation for wider policy objectives. Obviously, tackling climate change has been an important one, but also things like basically using public assets for local economic development, using public assets to make sure they're improving working conditions. Okay, so I think the database is a bit limited in what we can say here, but I think there's some quite stark lessons that do come out of the responses that we've had. I want to finish, if I've got enough time here, Fran, on some critical reflections on where we go with all this. As I think has already been alluded to, the database is the first attempt really to globally measure this process. And I think what we're quite clear about as we do this is the need to be open and transparent about the data, but also about its limitations. And there's an ongoing process amongst our researchers of verifying cases, being very transparent about our methodologies and how we go about things, because I think we're aware that we could be open to attack, and we need to make sure that we're not overclaiming in what the database can and what it can't do. I think that's particularly important because there has been a massive blind spot about remunicipalisation within some of these key hegemonic governance organizations that I've been talking about, the UN, the EU, and the IMF in particular, have not even acknowledged this as a global trend in their reports or in their publications. There's almost no official data about remunicipalisation. So what's in this database basically is what exists in terms of a global macro scale attempt to map things. But I think that blind spot is a political politics of denial, if you like, about this process that's going on. And of course, it's a politics of denial because a lot of the mainstream business and corporate establishment do not want to hear that privatization's failed. They do not want to hear that there are alternatives, and they do not want to hear that there's an alternative that takes key assets and resources away from private profiteering and puts them back in the service of public value. So I think that this data and the database has a real political dimension to it, whether we like it or not. And I think we need to be clear about that. This is why we need to be open and transparent about it, but we need to use it to kind of challenge mainstream narratives that are out there about privatization and how we run public services efficiently. I think it's becoming something of almost a hackneyed phrase to talk about how the pandemic has reinforced the need for local integrated public services. And John's made that point, I think very, very well. It's really exposed the weaknesses of the local state, the local public state, particularly in the UK, but elsewhere, of a decade of austerity, marketization, and privatization. And it's reinforced the need for local integrated public services, not just local publicly owned services in particular sectors, but the whole suite of integrated public services. As John put it, universal public services has to be back on the agenda as a policy goal, I think. I've talked a little bit about climate change, but I think what climate change reminds us of is that if you're going to really transform the economy in the way we need to deal with climate change, it can't be done by private market solutions. It needs massive levels of both of state resources, but it also needs massive levels of planning, traditional strategic integrated planning, if you're going to really shift the economy and society in a different direction. To finish, I think I'd point to the current moment as a really important one politically, in terms of what Stuart Hall and Gramsci would have talked to, a particular juncture, a particular moment of wider crises coming together. And it seems to me it's in these crises that you do have the space for arguing for democratic public alternatives like the ones we're doing today. But I worry that at the moment, if we don't really get these alternatives out beyond the usual suspects on the left, to kind of influence broader debate, we might miss a trick again here, in the same way that we did with the financial crisis. You know, I think you can see how a business as usual style set of solutions could come forward from the centre and the centre right, where we have a little bit of mild Keynesianism, a little bit of investment in high profile public services, whilst other public services are kind of forgotten about, or particularly in local government, we might see the new rounds of austerity coming in below the radar. So I think that's a real concern. I also have a concern that if the left and the broad left doesn't get on board with this agenda, and we're opening up space as privatization and market solutions continue to fail, we're opening up space for the far right to perhaps take the mantle of public control and ownership in more exclusionary directions that none of us, I think, in this workshop would want to see happen. We've written a little bit about this in some of the papers that you can see below the PowerPoint, but I'll leave it in there, and perhaps we can pick up on some of these issues in the Q&A that follows. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Andy, and I'm sure you've given people a lot of food for thought already. Certainly some questions are coming in for you. Can I just remind everyone that if you want to ask a question, to use the Q&A function that's down at the bottom of your screen. There are some questions going into chat, but we'd rather they were all funneled through there, just so we know exactly who wants a question to be asked during the webinar. Okay, so we're going to move over to Laura now, who's our expert on the database itself, and she'll talk everyone through how to use it and its various capabilities. So Laura.
All right, thanks. So without further ado, I would just move to the website to quickly walk through it all together. So as we mentioned beforehand, do you all see the website now? Perfect. So as we mentioned earlier, you can use this website or work with the website as a user and as a contributor. So first of all, as a user, after landing on the website and seeing the overall description of the project and of the data, the first thing you will encounter is this global map, and that is a tool for giving you a first overview of the location of the cases and of the distribution of the cases, so you can move around this map and zoom into any area of interest, and then maybe click on a country that interests you, and you can see these respective cases down below. The overall data set can be found below this map. So here you have a list of all the cases we collected. So you can move through them, and below here in the left, you can adjust the order of cases. So you can decide whether you want to order them to country or to what's been added most recently. Here you can decide how sophisticated you want the display to be. So you can add more information or make it a little bit more simple. And then here in the upper right corner, you can always see the total amount of cases as of the day you visit the site. Then to see the specific information that was been able to be collected for any case, you simply click here on the case, and then the case information unfolds. So first of all, you can see some basic information on the case, such as the country or the location or the population that's affected. And then further down, you can have an insight into categories that have been introduced to systematize the data a little bit more, or provide a little bit more categories, such as the type of deprivatization, so whether the service has been deprivatized, whether a new service entity has been set up to provide the service. And then we also have here a category like process of deprivatization, and that gives more information about whether contract has been expired, whether it has been terminated by the public sector, and so on. And then here we list, as Andy mentioned, the motivations and outcomes of the case. I will say a little bit about these categories further onwards. Below that, you will find the case summary that basically contains more information in the form of a text, so about the process and about the context. And below the summary, you can find the sources to the case, and also go and, I don't know if you can see this now, but basically you can also click on them if you want to read more into that specific case that you found. Right, so that is the way you can kind of look at the database as such. If you are interested in a specific place or in a specific area of the database, you can make according selections here in this area. And then you can say, okay, I want to know the cases that have been taking place in France. You can click on search, and then you can only look at those cases. And as you can see, adjust accordingly, this amount of cases here is adjusted also. And then you can go further and make first, like, say, statistical insights by making combinations that interest you. So you can say, okay, as we have heard, the water sector was an interesting sector in France, so you can see how many cases have been happening there. So you see, okay, 111 cases, and now you might be, okay, so how many of these cases were municipalizations? So you go ahead and select that and search. And then you can see, oh, none of those have been municipalized. So you can go back ahead and say, okay, so maybe all of those were, not this one. So you can see how many ones were remunicipalized and search again. And in that case, all of the French water cases were taken back to the public sector. And so that's just an example how you can work online with the database. If you want to further work with the database remotely or for your own purposes, then you can click here on download, and that allows you to download the entire database if you just simply click here on the download button. And then again, if you want to only have the cases from France, you can make the adjustments here. in these drop-down menus. So as I said, the database contains all these categories to be able to cluster the data a little bit. You find explanations, so I'm not going to now give you all the 25 definitions of all the categories, but you're welcome to put any more specific questions about this in the chat. Then I can address them later on. And overall, you find detailed explanations of all the categories here in the methods part in this table. And here you also find a bit of context on the research project as such. And so this is how you can work with public futures for, simply for learning about cases or for studying or for your work or for research. But then you can also directly contribute to this database. So say if you have heard about or you were involved in a case in a specific location, you can have a look like the country or the location of ABC. No, there's no data for this. So you can go, let me quickly log out. So you can go and click here above on Submit Case. Now you will be asked to create an account so that your data can actually be stored somewhere, and you can easily do that by just simply by giving your email, choosing a password, and then you get a link. So that's fairly quick. And then you can log in and enable this Submit Case form. And so this submitting a case form will take you through all these categories that I previously showed you in this database. And then you simply go ahead and enter everything, you know, so as I said, like, okay, the location ABC and the population and so on and so forth. Then further down, you will find the categories type of deprivatization and process of deprivatization. In order to, so that you don't have to move back to this methods table, we provide you explanations for these categories here in these information icons. Then you can make your selection based on that. Don't worry if you enter wrong data, your information will be checked later on by the research team. So it's not going to go online immediately. So you don't have to worry about entering anything if you're not sure. And also, if you cannot access this explanation technically, or your browser cannot read it out loud to you, you're still able to click Other and then enter your info here in the text field, and then we can see how it fits in with the categories, or whether we even open a new category for that. So then further down below, you will find this text field summary, where you can enter a little bit more context of your case and describe how the service provision worked before, or maybe you want to elaborate a little bit more on if you chose, for instance, something like cost reduction here, or like lower fees. You can here, if you have more information on this or a little bit more context, this allows you to elaborate a little bit. And then finally, you can add links and documents, and then you can submit. Now, as you see, I didn't fill all this form in, and maybe because I don't have the time right now, and maybe you also don't have the time when you do that at home, because you figure, okay, this takes a little bit of insight, or maybe you want to look into some information again, then you can save this case as a draft. And then in your dashboard or in your My Account area, you can go to My Drafts. And I left a draft before, which I imagine to be some sort of park maintenance as a small local service in Belgium. And so you can go, quickly move. So you can move back into this case at a later stage. And then you can double check your entries or maybe change something. And as I said here, for instance, I was not sure, okay, a public referendum, where do I put this? So I just put it here in the text box, and then we can take a look at this later on. Now, if you edit all, then please also take a moment to read this informed consent that's telling you where and how we are storing the data. And if you agree to that, you are ready to submit your case. After you submit your case, we get an email and we start the process of verification. And for that time, you will find the case here in My Cases. And yeah, that basically waits for verification. If in the meanwhile, we go back to this case and verify the data or add anything or change the categories, and then you will see that the status here changes. Also, you will receive an email that your case has been added. And other than that, you will also find the case here in the right lower corner of the website under New Cases. And from there on, you're also really welcome to share your new case submission with your partners or peers or any interested people. Yeah, so this is how we would like you to contribute if you can. Other than that, if you're using the website and you see anything that you could add or have any concerns about or questions about something that you don't understand, and also for technical issues, of course, and bugs, you can click here on this little bug symbol, and that's going to quickly open a email form where you can drop your message. So you don't have to sign up and do all the process. Yeah, so that's basically how you can work with this website. Moreover, you will find information about how to cite the database when you're working with it. Here you have our contact. So if you have any suggestions on like other categories or better ways of displaying the data, if you have any feedback or any questions, just email us and get in touch. Or if you are involved in the case and you want to get in touch with the research team, you're really welcome to do so as well. And then here below you'll find some more resources on the topic. And yeah, the final thing I want to take your attention to is here this share button, with which you can share the website yeah, to your partners or any other interested people. And those buttons you also find behind every case. So yeah, I hope you will have joy and gain knowledge using this website. And for any more questions, just mail us or use the Q&A. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Laura. That was great. Thanks for the walkthrough. If anyone has any more questions, as Laura said, do put them in the Q&A and she can always answer them in a bit. Also, just to say, we've had loads of great people introducing themselves in the chat. Do feel free to get in touch with us, as Laura said, either through the Global Remunicipalisation website or through the database. We check both. And then now we'll move on to our final speaker, and that is Daria Cibrario from PSI.
Thank you, Francisca. Thanks, everyone. Good afternoon. And indeed, it is a pleasure and an honor to join this distinguished panel and colleagues and comrades, leaders, academics, and activists who've been contributing so much to the launch of the Public Futures database. It is indeed a milestone also from the perspective of our organization, Public Services International, which for those who are not familiar with it is the global trade union federation representing public service workers. We represent 700 workers organizations, which bring the voice of 30 million women and men who daily deliver public services in 154 countries, including in the services and utilities, many of which you see on this database. So let me just, for those who may not be so familiar with the role of unions with public services and with this movement, let me just make a few considerations. Why are workers and public service workers in particular and their trade unions so interested in public services insourcing? Well, for many reasons. First of all, because working in public services is not just any job, it carries an ethos and a responsibility to the community. And it's been over 20 years that public service workers and their unions are denouncing the ravages socially and economically, but also environmentally, of the commodification and marketization of services that have been privatized or have undergone PPPs. But also because workers are the collective actor which is entrenched in the service which undergoes the transition from private to public, and therefore is a key actor to take into account to ensure that remunicipalization is successful. We're very pleased to continue to contribute to this collective effort to change and shift the narrative and to showcase that remunicipalization and insourcing is not just a dream, but it is a viable, reliable, and possible policy option for any government, especially as John McDowell was saying, at the local level, and especially at this very time of crisis. And this is something I want to stress very much, because as a global union federation, if we look at what is happening in the rest of the world, the crisis has actually emboldened the demand to reclaim public services for the public and not for profit. It has actually created a convergence of demand among not only progressive social movement trade unions, but also local governments, local councils of all stripes, which find themselves in a real urgent situation, having to deliver essential, vital public services to communities and being defunded, not having enough powers, not having enough staff, and actually having sometimes to cut stuff at the very moment where the services they can provide are actually life-saving. So why is this the time to reclaim collectively and work together even more on this database, but as Andy said before, to bring out the message and to seek to influence very strongly organizations and decision makers who have not really paid attention for various reasons, or have turned a blind eye to remunicipalization? Well, because lack of equitable public services kills. People die when we don't have equitable access to health, to care, and to housing. People die especially in developing countries, but also in our developed countries. And all of a sudden, the pandemic has showed it. It is under everyone's eyes. If it was already unacceptable that lack of equitable access to public services creates inequality, injustice, and exclusion, today, this is no longer acceptable, because the virus has created a thread of interdependency between the health and the conditions of those who are affected by the virus and those who can potentially be affected by the virus. Not only this situation, the lack of access to equitable public services, is causing a meltdown of our economy and of our societies if we do not tackle it in a smart way by funding and by staffing correctly our life-saving public services. So this is why this is a time for us to come together and reclaim services for the people to live a meaningful and dignified life, to stop seeing them as a product or a service that you sell to customers, but to turn it around and see public service users as right holders. And therefore, this is the time to take public services out of the market economy and back into what David Hall has called the human economy, or Andy Cumbers talks about democratizing the economy, making the economy democratic again. So, and we talk about public services 2.0. So this is no longer a time where we can have the same economic system running the sale of clothes and the sale of healthcare. And there is ferment everywhere in the world to change this. And I want to just mention a few cases that are actually ongoing. There are fights to reclaim services around the world. The first case I want to flag up is Canada, where long-term care homes have recorded the highest rate of deaths among residents and staff worldwide. And just by accident, it happens that these care homes are majority owned by a private company called Revera, which, by the way, also operates in the UK. And this company, on top of that, practices aggressive tax avoidance. It practices aggressive tax avoidance and uses offshore subsidiaries in tax havens. And now our affiliate in Canada, which is CUPE, the Canadian Union of Public Employees, is teaming up with other social movements, but is by itself reclaiming and insourcing of these essential services under the public control. And there are 2/3 of the Canadian people who are in favor of bringing back in-house this essential service. There's also obviously a demand that health is no longer run for profit. And we've seen how the systematic privatization, outsourcing, and defunding of many services, including in countries which have traditionally very strong public healthcare systems, such as the NHS in the UK, but also in France, have performed badly because of this situation. So there's a demand to bring back, to in-source services so that our public health care systems can be strong again and thrive and deliver the superior health options they need to deliver. Not only PSI is very active right now with affiliates and other progressive social groups to call for a waiver on the patents of COVID vaccines, which are currently protected under the trade agreements. And we are also calling for a halt to the competition and the private monopolies of life-saving drugs, and to a relocation of long supply chains of PPEs and drugs that save lives. Last point of another ongoing struggle, which, by the way, is now erupting in sectors that in the past were considered kind of lost to privatization, is energy. In France, the proposal by the current government to unbundle the national electricity utility has spurred outrage after a first round of partial privatization in 2004. The price of energy and electricity in France has doubled. And now there's a coalition of energy trade unions, but also national and local MPs and progressive groups, which are reclaiming electricity and energy as a strategic public service to ensure that it doesn't end up again into energy poverty, and that it is used as a strategic resource to bolster local economic development in-house in the territories. Last but not least, it is also the time to reclaim public and social housing as an essential service. It is the most financialized service in the world. If you look at the data from the former special rapporteur of the UN on the right to housing, they are scary. While at the same time, in full pandemic, there are 1.8 billion people worldwide who lack adequate housing, and there is no investment in public housing. It is interesting that the special rapporteur last year called on a halt to privatize and to get rid of social and public housing stocks, and that the EU Parliament has just passed a resolution this January asking that public housing is part of the action plan on the recovery package. So there's a lot happening, and there's a lot more that can happen, because this is ultimately about reclaiming our institutions. It is about reclaiming democracy. It is also about reclaiming the taxpayer money, our money, the way we want it to be spent. And here I want to make an important point, going back to what John said at the beginning. If we want to consolidate our increasingly stronger counter narrative, which is to neutralize the pro-liberalization and pro-privatization dominant narrative, we also need to build collectively evidence of viable public funding solutions, especially for local public services, because right now what is happening is that in the pandemic, the local councils are under extreme pressure. Some are already in bankruptcy, especially in the UK, in Canada, in the US, but everywhere in the world where cities and local governments are run increasingly as companies, and budgetary rules are extremely strict. It is time also to reclaim public finance. It is time to show that public banks are an option, that public procurement can and must be used locally in a strategic way, that we need to reform the corporate taxation, and that tax justice is not only at the global and at the national level that requires a big fix, but also at the municipal and local government level, because eventually that is where the money has to be channeled to deliver life-saving public services for all. And again, let's think and step up our advocacy, and let's showcase also what intermunicipal consortiums and public-public partnerships can do. And with that, I would just like to conclude again, congratulating you all, and also TNI, which is in the public but not appearing on the panel, for these relentless and I would say almost heroic work. But the real work starts and continues now that we have a really strong platform, and we can actually unveil what often is remains under the radar. These remunicipalization news don't make the headlines. They're not very sexy. Not only, let's not forget that increasingly local newspapers which cover this kind of news are failing, are going bankrupt one after the other. This is why we also need to put on our agenda reclaiming the media for the public and for the common good. Media must be used in the common interest, because they are a key foundation of our democracy. And so that is very important. Just to conclude, let's not forget that this is a collective effort, and I liked very much what John said at the beginning. He became a local councillor, and he got engaged in the local government precisely because he wanted to change the world and build the public services of the future. This is exactly the same junction we're at now. It is time to engage ourselves also in our local communities, and as much as we can globally, to advocate and to bring the message out there, and to experiment, to bring innovation and renewal in public services. Thank you very much. And again, congratulations.
Yeah, thank you, Daria. That was a great call to arms to have as our last contribution. And actually, thank you to all of the 4 speakers on the panel today. Those were fantastic contributions. Lots of food for thought here, and also obviously lots of questions that have been coming in. So we're running a bit behind. So I would encourage everyone answering questions to keep it brief so we can answer as many as possible. But thank you again very much for your contributions. And yeah, we thought we would start the Q&A with not an easy question for John McDonnell, sorry. And the question is from Emanuele Lubina, and he asked, I guess he asked it in a UK specific context, but I guess we can include for our international audience a sort of, not just the Conservative Party in Britain, which is obviously in power in Britain right now, but it generally politically hostile governments around the world. How realistic is it that these will also be driving remunicipalisation in the near future? And I guess building on that, how do we work against these politically hostile climates to build public ownership from the bottom up?
The issue for me is exactly as Daria said, and in others, it's about building an unstoppable climate of opinion. It is about hegemony. And I just go back to the history of when there was a significant paradigm change after the Second World War in this country with the Attlee Labour government. There was a paradigm change which actually put public ownership firmly on the agenda, linked to full employment and linked to trade union rights, having looked back on the 1930s and progressives, socialists and progressives saying never again, and they changed the world there and then. But they dominated, they were only in government for a very limited period of time, but they established hegemony so that the incoming Conservative government in 1951 still had to go on building council houses. The council house that I moved out of a Liverpool slum into a council house as a child. It was built by a Tory government, but only because a Labour government had dominated the ideas for such a period. And those ideas actually dominated for the next generation, for the next 25 years, only to be challenged by neoliberalism eventually. So I think, one, we've got to create an unstoppable climate of opinion. Secondly, it's interesting for those involved in the UK politics, alongside this discussion about public ownership, there's also a discussion about our constitution and about devolution of powers, not just to Scotland or Wales, but also to regional radical federalism across England as well. And we've already got a number of directly elected mayors who've, in this pandemic, people like Andy Burnham in Manchester, etc., are standing up and representing their communities quite independently and demanding policy change and resources that they can implement at the local. Then below that, in terms of structures of local government in this country, we've now got a large number of local authorities experimenting with community wealth building. So you can see every tier of government at the moment, there is a discussion going on about the need for public services to be developed. And even in central government, during the pandemic, just take, for example, the railway industry, where private firms have collapsed virtually and they've had to be brought back into public ownership or public democratic control just for their survival of that public service. So I think the game, it's a new game now, and I think the field is wide open, but there is such a thing as political agency, and what we've got to be is the political agents of that change, winning the argument, developing the facilities and resources so that people can experiment with public ownership once again, remunicipalisation. That's why this database is so fundamentally important, because it'll give people confidence and knowledge about how you go about it.
Thank you, John. We have a question now from someone who's attending in Kenya, who asks Andrew, what needs to happen to further drive the public ownership trend into municipalities in the global south? How can the influence of international organizations such as the World Bank, IFC, and the privatisation be overturned?
Great question, and I probably need a few days to respond to it properly. I guess a quick response coming out of the database is that I think locally, when you're struggling against privatization, you can access these broader resources and show what's happening elsewhere. There's another project I've been involved with across Europe on municipal energy, and I think what really helps perhaps actors in places that feel that they're not very empowered, what really helps them with their local politicians and leaders is when they can point to examples of better progressive solutions that are happening elsewhere, and even getting some dialogue between what's happening elsewhere and your local key political actors to say, actually, alternatives, you can develop alternatives. I know, for example, in South America, a lot of the pushback against privatization there was by municipalities, trade unions, getting together from different parts of Latin America to help each other and build kind of what they call public partnerships, where you could share knowledge, information, and even skills that say, actually, there's an alternative to just accepting we only get money and finance if we privatize and let big corporations in. So I think if you're looking for examples from the rest of the world about how you begin to develop a strategy, have a look at what's been going on in South America, particularly with the water sector, and how some municipalities have resisted privatization and World Bank efforts by teaming up and partnering with other municipalities. I know in the water sector, I think Yokohama in Japan some time back was a public body that was actually funding and financing and helping municipalities in the global south build public water systems. So I think kind of cross or I guess translocal dialogues is one response. I mean, the other response is to keep pushing the agenda onto these bigger organizations, the World Bank, the European Union, and so on. Someone else has written in the chat, I noticed that okay, the European Commission is very neoliberal and conservative, but the European Parliament is doing some interesting things. So I think we've got to keep lobbying. We've got to keep engaging with these broader institutions to force this alternative on the agenda so that they have to respond. So I think there's a sort of, there's different strands to a sort of campaign that you can develop there.
Thanks for that, Andy. There's a couple of questions here about the database, which we could take together, I think, and address to Laura. One is regarding the limitations of the database, but you've sort of hinted at this already, and the full version of our report does cover this in some depth, but it's worth asking just now what the user should be aware of, for example, when reading the information on the website, what's not included, and a follow-up, would it be possible to add the value of contracts to the database?
Yeah, sure. So maybe a word on how the data has been collected. So mainly this has come through official sources like press releases, newspaper articles, and whatever has been available on municipalities' websites. And so, of course, we have not been able to fill in all the categories for each and every case. And I think this is how the database can like now that it's launched, we can work on filling these gaps more efficiently by just having a quicker access between the actual database and the people who are involved in the process. And it makes it probably easier for us to fill those gaps.
Okay, thanks, Laura.
Yes. Sorry. Maybe if Andy could say something quickly again to the first part of the limitations, what he meant with that, because I did see that coming up in the chat quite a lot.
Yeah, I mean, building on what Laura's just said, I think we have. I think it's worth emphasising this database has been collected by sort of a volunteer activist, civil society, transnational alliance, kind of marshaled incredibly by Satoko and people at TNI. So a lot of the data that we're getting is from people located in particular regions or parts of the world, who then supply what's officially available or what's available in press releases to TNI to go in the database, which we then, when we have the time, not me, but other researchers, when they have the time, can verify and look at. So we're, it's publicly accessible database that we're kind of bringing that together in the database. So there's real limitations. So somebody, for example, asked about whether we could have another set of data about the kind of contracts and all that financial information. I mean, that just doesn't exist. in the way we'd like. It exists for some cases, but not others. So we really are, this database is reflecting what we can gather from what's publicly available and what we can gather from key people involved in particular places. So we have to be very open and transparent about that process, because if we do begin to get attention, the mainstream are going to attack us for this data, and they're going to try and undermine the data. So I think we need to be open and transparent. By the way, as a social scientist researcher, you should be very open about your methodology anyway. And interestingly, a lot of official statistics aren't very open and transparent, even though they're often quite flawed statistics. But I think our purpose here is to have this interactive database that people can look at, and if there's a case that they look at and say, actually, this isn't right, that they get in touch with us and tell us, and we can verify it. Because I think it's one thing to put this database together, but actually to make it strong and robust to criticism, we need to have a sort of constant ongoing process of verification. I mean, we've only got a certain number of people here to do that, and they're all involved in other things in their day job. So a lot of this, Laura's done heroic work over the last year, basically in the evenings in her part-time, apart from her PhD in verification, as have various other people within my team, like Francisca, like Beth, like Emilia in Latin America. So a lot of this is a kind of heroic voluntary effort, if you like. But I think it's important that we're clear about the limitations to the data and what it can do and what it can't do. For us, it shines a light on an important trend and development, and we can say quite a bit about that. But we have to be clear there's quite a lot we don't know about, which actually, is for those of you out there who are researchers, plenty of potential to start going away and writing research proposals to work with the data and build on it.
Great, thanks, Andy. We have a question here which I think would suit Andy or John, so either you're welcome to take it. The ethos of major institutions such as OECD, EU, etc., favouring the tendering of all public services is firmly entrenched in the mindset of local actors, as reflected in the regional economic development strategies in Scotland. How do we begin to shift this?
We challenge it at every opportunity. It's as simple as that. I think there's battles going on now within virtually every institution, global institutions included, about the way forward for the next couple of generations. And it's been forced upon them by not just the banking crash in 2007, 2008, but the subsequent recessions that have taken place as a result of austerity measures, the climate change threats that there are, which have, in terms of the economic policies pursued by some of these global institutions, has undermined the resilience of countries, particularly in the global south, to be able to respond to climate change. But on top of that, the pandemic itself has been like a pressure test for every economic global institution. So I think there's a real debate, discussion. In fact, I think it's an ideological struggle going on within both the institutions themselves, but also those who are affected by their policies. And that gives us, I'm afraid the tragedy of the pandemic also opens up an opportunity to have that discussion about the way forward and looking at the catastrophic mistakes that have taken place, particularly as a result of some of the policies imposed on the global south by the IMF, the World Bank, and others. So I think it behoves us at every opportunity to be raising these issues and challenging existing policy, and also making alliances across the globe with those across progressive and social political parties and trade unions and civil society organizations that are raising these issues. And I just come back to, I don't want to exaggerate the importance of the database, but I do think people should recognize the importance of it. It's Andy's point. Just being able to point to concrete examples of what's going on does inspire confidence, and it adds to the argument that you can make around this whole philosophical approach, ideological approach, if you like, but is actually very concrete on the basis of what's being rolled out on the ground. And for me, just as a campaigner, if you like, it will give me the opportunity to actually say, well, look at what's happening here. This is successful. Sometimes we have to say also this has failed, so let's learn the lessons from that. So it's such a good resource in having that argument or struggle really within these institutions.
Well, one thing I'd add to that very, very quickly in answer to that question is, I wonder, this is a sort of theoretical political answer in a way, but I wonder if a lot of activists have kind of, there's a lot of activists on the left have almost demonized the state. And I don't think that's very helpful. And I think building on what John says, you have to fight that official mindset, because in my experience in Scotland and actually talking to civil servants across the UK, it's often a particular mindset. They've grown up with neoliberalism. They're all in the UK. They're all Thatcher's children to some extent. They've grown up with this mindset about what's possible and what isn't possible. And I think you can only challenge that if you get involved in debates and seminars with public officials. So I think rather than just having a purified activist view where we don't touch the state, it is in and against and beyond the state. You do have to engage and contest what state officials are telling you. Very often in Scotland, I know, for example, with some of the legislative powers they have here, it's often civil servants who are not enacting legislation properly on things like workers' rights in public services and contracting out, for example, by telling you you can't do that. And actually, they're often not even up to speed with the legislation within their own legislatures, if you like. So I think you do have to be active within the state in a very radical democratic way here. And we do, and I think you can build from the local level up here. You can win the victories at the local level, but then you can begin to push. But I do think that the state is too important for us to leave alone in this kind of struggle, and we have to have a completely different view of what the state is to do that.
Thanks, Andy. And on that note of transforming the entire state, I'm afraid we've run out of time, but it's a nice thought to leave us all with. So just before the webinar closes, can I thank everyone for coming? We haven't managed to answer all the questions, but we will try and answer those personally afterwards. Thank you for our panelists for attending. Thank you to the Wi-Fi gods for serving us well through the whole thing. We'll also be recording the webinar and we'll be posting that up to the database and sharing on various websites as well if you would like to see all of it. As I mentioned earlier, we'll be publishing the full report soon, so watch this space for that. And we've also noticed personally lots of interesting organisations who are in attendance and have engaged with us on the chat. So please do get in touch. It will add to the strength of the database and our research. So thank you again, and everyone have a good weekend.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.